Hi all. So now we are going to deal with the second part of Philip Freneau's The Indian Burying Ground. Okay, so in the previous part we had dealt with the fourth stanza till the fourth stanza, and so now we are moving from the fifth stanza till the end of the poem. So here we go. The fifth stanza begins this way: Thou stranger that shall come this way. So you find, as I told you earlier, the first part of the poem till the fourth stanza talks about how the burial ground is, the Indian burial ground is. But now from this part onwards, it talks about how the burial ground has to be perceived, how it has to be revered, how it has to be visited, and so on. So he imagines, the speaker imagines, that there will be quite a few visitors in the days to come, and so the burial ground will eventually become a place of instruction. And he says, when you come there, be careful. Don't commit any fraud upon this dead here. Okay, and he says, because when you do that, what does he mean? Do not commit fraud. Do not have any misconception of the native customs or their beliefs. So it's a false interpretation that he warns us of the visitors to be wary of. And he says, when you do that, if you get into a kind of a false interpretation, it's going to be a kind of injustice that you commit towards the dead. And he says, observe the swelling turf and say. So where the dead are buried, and there is a kind of a swelling, a mound there, and their earth is raised. So he's saying, when you come here, beware, do not tread on them. So when you see the earth, the mound there, the earth in the raised form there, that's kind of a visible evidence, and so the visitors have to be very careful there. And he says, they do not lie, but here they sit. So like the other graveyards where the dead are buried in the horizontal position and where they are lying and where they are supposed to be in eternal sleep, here what are they doing? They are sitting and with their friends they are having a communal feast. So here they are seated upright, they are buried upright, and so they are very alert, and the dead seems to be very engaged with their friends also. So the sitting posture is a kind of a reminder to all those who visit about the readiness of the dead, the awareness of the dead, how they are aware of what's happening around them, their participation in everything there, and their continued existence. So death does not sever them from the life here, but they seem to be existing. It's only their physical body that is dead, but their soul is very active throughout. So the dead are not just passive sleepers, they are active members of what? Of a continuing spiritual community. So now we move on to the next stanza, that's the sixth one, and he says, here still a lofty rock remains, and the speaker seems to be pointing to a surviving monument of the past. And here the rock symbolizes what? Permanence and memory. So he says, on which the curious eye may trace. So when you come there to the turf, to the ground, when you see the earth raised, and when you see that there is a mound, immediately you will look at a lofty rock and your eyes will go there, and your curiosity will lead you on to trace something, and you will see certain markings left by the Native Americans, because they must have drawn something on the rock there, on the lofty rock there. Now that drawing is not fully alive because it's now wasted half by wearing rains. So time and weather have damaged these markings, and this nature has slowly erased everything. Erased what? All the accomplishments of the Native Americans, all the human achievements, the fancies of a ruder race. So the carvings on the rock, on the lofty rock, they are talking about the native imagination, or how the imagination of the Native Americans ran so wildly. And here the poet seems to be referring to them as a ruder race. That doesn't mean that he is disrespectful, but he seems to be employing the 18th century language here. Of course, we know that the poet is all respectful towards the dead and their community. So here you find the fancies is a word, and that's been used by the poet very, very cautiously. And this particular word talks about the creativity and imagination of the people, of the Native Americans. So now the markings on the rock, lofty rock, that have lost their charm, that no more have the same vigor, might remind us of how human civilization may disappear. There might be certain traces, but nature somehow preserves the fragments of these historical traces. And so that is what we'll have to look into in the 6th stanza, and we move on to the 7th stanza. And there again, not just a rock, here you find an elm, and this elm tree is not a young tree, it's an aged tree. Okay, and this elm tree seems to be aspiring. Why is it aspiring? Because the elm tree seems to be growing upward. Okay, and its upward growth indicates how it's aspiring. I'm sure it symbolizes endurance and continuity beneath whose far projecting shade. So it's tall, it's reaching upward, it's aspiring, and at the same time it's very shady. And as I told you, it's not a young tree, it's a very age-old tree, and so it has so many branches that it seems to be providing shelter to all those who come under it or to it, and which the shepherd still admires. So when the Native Americans take their flock and their cattle for grazing, or cattle for grazing, they seem to be admiring not just the shepherd of the past, but even the modern people who come there to look at the Indian burying ground, to look at the uniqueness of the Indian burying ground. They are captivated, or they are enchanted by the elm tree, the way it aspires towards the sky, the way it spreads out to give shade to all, and also at the lofty rock. Okay, so now they admire, and it's here the children of the forest played. So it doesn't refer to only the children of the Native Americans, even the Native Americans who were in proximity with nature, who were very close to the pristine nature, who considered nature as their mother. So even the Native Americans are considered to be the children. That is why probably the poet Philip Freneau uses the phrase children of the forest, referring to the Native American. And he says the tree is so old that it must have certainly witnessed the active life of these Native Americans. So the elm tree now becomes a living memorial. It is a living monument. It's a living testimony. It's a living witness of, and so this particular aspect of nature remembers how the human history evolved. And so the tree is a bridge between the past and the present. It links the past with the present. So that's what you see. And we now move on to stanza 8. We see that they're oft a restless Indian queen. So now suddenly the speaker imagines a female spirit on the burying ground. And how is this female spirit? Equally restless like the male spirit, and the female spirit is also restless. So again implying continuity or life after death, or activity after death. And so pale Sheba with her braided hair. So this pale, why is she pale? Because she's a spirit. She's hovering over the Indian burying ground, native Indian burying ground. And this pale Sheba, who's ghost-like, she has braided her hair, as you see in this picture. So this braiding of hair is again another aspect of retaining their cultural identity. So even after she is dead, people recognize her as one of the members of their native Indian community. Okay, and many a barbarous form is seen. So not just this pale Sheba. They in the Indian burying ground, people who visit that burying ground, they see quite a few native spirits that are wandering in that area. So they can see that. And so you find that the burial ground, though it's not populated by people, it's populated by the spirits, by the ghosts. And so it is again active. It's not a lonely place. It's not a very calm place. It's full of activity, because you find lots of ghosts and lots of spirits there, and you find supernatural presences there. And so it's again very, very lively. So to chide the man that lingers there. So here, why? The spirits are there. They're hovering over the Indian burying ground. So if you casually walk through the mounds there, mounds, mounds there, the spirits that are hovering over the burying ground, they may try to rebuke all the intruders, saying, hey, look here, you're going to disturb us. We are having a fun time here. We are having a good celebration here. Why do you come here and disturb us? So it's going to rebuke all the intruders, whoever comes there. And so, please deal with that burial ground as a sacred place. And please understand that this burial ground has to be looked at with all reverence, with all respect, as it itself demands too much of respect from all those who visit that place. So beware, do not disturb all the spirits that are actively hovering over the Indian burying ground. So, the dead are no more just resting. They're connected with one another, and in that burial place they seem to be so connected. So they are not absent. Don't think that they're dead and they're gone. No, nothing like that. They're spiritually present there. So they are active. They're not absent. They are present there. So when you go there, you are kind of disturbing them. So do not go there and disturb them. Do not become an intruder there. Okay, so with that we move on to the next stanza, which says, by midnight moons over moistening dews. So now, if it was all the description so far was about the morning. There was no specification as such, but suddenly the setting becomes too mysterious and supernatural, because it talks about what moons, not just any moon, about the midnight moon. And the moonlight, the midnight and the dew, they create a kind of a dream-like atmosphere, and making it all the more mystery-filled and full of supernatural elements there. So inhabit for the chase arrayed. Now look here, as I told you earlier, the ghosts seem to be very active, engaged in life, and they are not just lying there, they're going on hunting, and they look like they're all dressed for hunting. And so, like the warrior who had his bow there in the previous stanzas, you have the hunter also almost ready, and he is also battling with the death of his physical body, and his soul seems to be very active, and he seems to be surviving the death. And see here, the hunter, still the deer pursues. So the game of hunting is still happening. It has not come to an end. So the game or the activity of hunting the deer, which is a favorite game of all the hunters of their community, still continues, and it goes, or it is extended beyond the grave. So repetition of this concept that there is an afterlife after death. So there is a life after death, and there is an existence after the earthly existence. Okay, so the hunter and the deer are shared. Now don't imagine that there's a hunter coming up, rising up from the grave, and then he's riding on his horse or something, and then he's hunting a deer. No, they are a shade, meaning to say they are kind of spirits now. So look here, the whole of the natural world seem to be in a participatory mode. They seem to be participating in a kind of a spiritual existence, and that's what is happening here, and it's wonderful to watch. Okay, so death seems to be transforming the existence. So on the earth they were existing in a different form, maybe physically, tangibly, but after deaths they seem to be existing still, but in the form of a shade, that is to say in the form of the spirits. So the activities of the life seem to be continuing in the next realm also, and this is one of the very strongest expressions of the Native American spirituality. So it is the core or the essence of the Native American spirituality that you find documented in this poem. So now we move on to the last stanza of the poem, which says, "And long shall timorous fancy see." So he says, yeah, please continue to imagine, and the life of these spirits will continue as long as the human imagination is there. So you tend to imagine more and more, you tend to see or perceive more and more ghostly figures. So the more you imagine, the more ghostly figures you will see. And this timorous fancy means fearful imagination. So this fear is not about the fear of being in a kind of in a scary place, but it's a kind of a sacred place, as he pointed out earlier. So for fear is also something that's always associated with reverence, with sanctity. So what sort of imagination should you have? You should have a kind of a fearful imagination. That's what he says here. So the painted chief and pointed spear, rhyming, So the people imagine now. So as I told you, as long as human imagination runs wild, so long will you get to see more and more ghostly figures. So the more and more people imagine, the more and more native warriors they will see. And what sort of warriors will they see? They will see warriors such as the painted chief, and they will see warriors or the painted chief carrying the spear. And how is the spear? It's also pointed. So all of them talk about the traditional ceremonial appearance. Okay, and reason's self shall bow the knee. And this is the climax of the poem. No more questioning, no more logical reasoning. Reasoning will have to surrender. Logic and rationality have to surrender before imagination, and that's what it is. And he says you'll have to submit. Okay, so to shadows and delusions here. So what are you surrendering your logic and reasoning to? Or what are you bowing before? You are kneeling before the shadows that I told you are the spirit's delusions, kind of imagination that you get to tend to see. So the mysterious atmosphere overwhelms rational explanation. So the burial ground seems to be a kind of a muse. The landscape of the burial ground turns to be a muse because it seems to be inspiring the poet to write poem. So it's a kind of a poem muse, isn't it? And so the feelings that logic alone cannot dismiss. So you will have a kind of a feeling, and this feeling even the logical reasoning cannot dismiss. And so with that you come to the end of the poem, and here in the end of the poem you see that there is imagination which is surpassing reason. There is imagination that is succeeding reason or logical reason. So the poet seems to be telling us, or seems to be arguing, saying that certain things can be understood not through reasoning, not through logical questioning, not through kind of some knowledge, but then you can understand that through feelings, through emotions, through intuition, through imagination, and beyond all through spiritual feeling. So the poem is a celebration of Native American beliefs, because the Native Americans view death as a continuation of life rather than an end. So on the whole, through the burial customs, grave goods, that is to say the possessions that are left along with the dead, the ghostly visions, and the vivid natural imagery, Freneau, the poet, seems to be presenting the soul as eternally active. So the final message is that death is not asleep. The soul, according to the Native American, it remains alive and active. And so what is the role of nature? Nature seems to be preserving memory, and there is a deeper role of the imagination. And you find that imagination seems to be bringing forth truths beyond reason. And Native American spirituality seems to be offering a richer understanding of life and death. So I suppose you enjoyed this poem. Thank you so much for watching.